distracted by the finer things in life. You look shattered and he's broke, and all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you, and the fine line between wrong and right.
Growing old can mean a new chapter in life, and elderly locals are an important part of every community. So in 2003, a small town on the south coast of England was rocked by a violent crime on one of their own.
Burglars breaking into a house when people are asleep is rare, but burglars breaking into a house and murdering somebody so rare is untrue.
My husband Eric did not deserve this. As a frail man, any resistance he put up could easily have been overcome by these two young men. There was no need for them to go to the lengths they did.
The victims of this crime had got married in the later years of their lives and were hoping to grow old together. Sometimes things just don't go to plan when the very home that was meant to be a sanctuary becomes the scene of a brutal attack.
Plymouth is a large city in the southwest of England, the largest city in Devon, a major naval port. From a policing point of view, it's got many different neighbourhoods.
Plymouth as a whole is an interesting city because it is a city, but it's a city that's made up of little villages. One of those villages is Plympton, St Maurice. It's a little pocket community, had its own butcher shop, a little pub, a couple of little shops. Lots of families had been in the area for a really long time.
And it's fair to say that Plympton is not a high crime area.
It's a really tight, close community, and they look out for each other.
One of the prominent figures in the neighbourhood was 83-year-old Eric Hingston. He ran the local family butchers in Plympton for many years.
Eric had been a very active man. He'd had active war service, and then he'd worked in the butcher shop for many years up until his retirement. He still lived above the shop. He was a very intrinsic part of that community. His son had taken over the shop from him, but he was still a very familiar face. He used to go round to the pub close by. Everybody knew Eric.
Eric hadn't always been a butcher. Aged 18, he got his pilot's licence and joined the RAF.
Eric had an incredibly interesting past. He was part of a special operations group during the war, which flew covert missions into occupied France. An incredibly dangerous expedition, something that his family were incredibly proud of.
In 1950, Eric married his first wife, Jean. They had 2 children together.
After the war, Eric set up a butcher's shop, and I think he was 3 shops in the St Austell area. And then after his first wife died, he moved back to Plymouth and bought a shop in Underhill Lane.
Eric's wife, Jean, died in 1982.
And here he is, a widower, confronting, life without his life partner. I have no one to share my life with. So that's where we find Eric.
So it was widely welcomed a few years later when 62-year-old Eric found love again, this time with 60-year-old widow Audrey.
Audrey was friends with Eric prior to the death of the respective partners, and they were just friends. And I think that friendship blossomed, and eventually they married. Of course, both sides of the family had family. Eric had a family, and Audrey had a family, including sons and grandsons and granddaughters.
So Eric meets Audrey, who's also a widow. So they already have something in common. They've been through that loss process as individuals. They meet, they get together, and they get married. So from Eric's point of view, he's found love again.
They like to travel abroad. They like to go into the city centre and have a cup of coffee and look around the shops together.
Because Audrey was quite a spry woman and she was very fit for her age. And it's even been said that she wouldn't think twice about walking into Plymouth if she missed the bus, which would be 3 miles perhaps into the city centre. So she was very fit and very sociable.
They had an active life and one that they both enjoyed, and a caring relationship.
But when he turned 80, Eric's health took a severe downturn.
All of a sudden, Eric's got heart problems, he's asthmatic, he's got a catheter, he's had a hip replacement, the car's gone, the social life's disappeared. Audrey's looking after a very sick man.
Life changed for the couple following Eric's illness, and Audrey became his full-time carer. All of their future plans went on hold.
It meant Audrey changed from a companion to almost a carer. And I think there was quite a change in their life.
What happens when one partner gets ill and the other person perhaps takes on the role of carer is there's a shift in the power dynamic. It goes from being equal to I now look after him. So from her point of view, it might have been a very difficult position to find herself in. And I think from Eric's point of view, losing his health in that way may have also made him feel less than in the relationship. Here we are as equals, and suddenly I'm not able to do what I used to do. He may have felt some level of guilt, perhaps, that he can't be the man that she thought she married.
But Eric and Audrey seemed determined to make the best of things. Getting out locally as often as they could, they were well known in the area. Neighbour Sean Rouse still remembers seeing them throughout his childhood.
You would see them in the morning. You see them, they would be down at the front and you'd see them, you say hello, you know, the usual. They were lovely. Like, they'd always say hello. They weren't people that would just ignore you. They were genuine nice people.
On Friday 29th of August at 3:45 a.m, a panicked Audrey Hingston called 999.
999, which service do you require?
I received a phone call somewhere 4 o'clock in the morning to say that there'd been an incident at Underwood Road, Plimpton. I attended the scene.
Audrey said intruders had broken into the couple's flat and had stabbed her husband Eric. He had been seriously wounded. The emergency services responded immediately. Detective Chief Inspector Tony Carney was the senior investigating officer on duty that night.
Even after 17 years, it hasn't changed at all. In terms of looking at this scene, no, there's no difference whatsoever in the past 17 years. The road was taped off here, and there were police on the barrier, as it were, because they were diverting traffic. I came over to the door here and had a look at it. I noticed that there was no signs of forcible entry to the door, so I knocked on the glass, and funnily enough, it was answered by Audrey, who appeared in a very confused and shocked state.
Audrey's life had been torn apart. Her home had been invaded, Eric attacked, and now her home was a crime scene.
And I think I was actually at a paperboy at the time, had just started. And I just remember walking down from just up there, walking past and seeing all the tape.
Audrey, she was a very small woman. She was very neat and tidy. But she was obviously confused. She was upset. She was frightened. And you automatically felt sorry for her right away. And no, I wanted to get her away from the house.
Paramedics had got there within minutes, but it was already too late.
Audrey said that her husband had been attacked, and that is when we went upstairs to find Eric.
Eric Hingston had been found dead on the floor of the flat above the butcher's in the quiet Plymouth suburb of Plimpton. His fragile 81-year-old wife, Audrey, had made the desperate call to police.
Eric had been killed by a downward thrust from a long, sharp-bladed instrument. There wasn't a lot of blood at all. Eric was lying on the floor. His head was on a cushion, which I thought was strange at first. But then I saw patches on the floor and realised that he'd been defibrillated. What they hadn't realised, of course, was that Eric had a pacemaker. When the heart stops beating, the pacemaker kicks in to try and start it again, and it gives a sort of a false pulse, if you like. And this is what the paramedics had picked up, and they therefore thought that there was still life in Eric and tried to resuscitate him.
Senior investigating officer Tony tried to find out as much as he could from Audrey about what had happened.
She was sort of leaning forward, if you like, cringing, confused, frightened, and not absolutely coherent. She was sleeping in a different room to her husband, and she'd heard a disturbance. She went into the room where he was sleeping, and she was confronted by two men, two burglars, who, on seeing her, escaped through the open bedroom window, leaving behind a black bin liner by the window with the sort of items that they were intending to steal.
What looked like a robbery was now a murder inquiry, and a large police team was assembled, including Detective Inspector Neil Treby.
The body was taken to Derriford Hospital, and Audrey was taken by the family liaison officer to her son's address. Now, her son was a retired detective sergeant, and he lived in the city with his family. She needed support.
One of the other reasons we wanted to get her out of the house was that unintentionally she could well have contaminated the scene, if disturbed any evidence that there might be. So it was important for us to get her away. Obviously, we'd got work to do.
Police arrived at the house to search for any evidence left by the burglars that Audrey had seen.
The forensic team arrived and they cordoned off the building.
It looked like a typical burglary scene. The wardrobe doors were open, the drawers had been drawn open, the contents had been disturbed, thrown out onto the floor. There was a black bin liner by the window which had got items in it, including jewellery and other items, attractive items that they might want to steal.
When people enter premises, they will leave traces. They will leave articles of clothing. There could be skin, there could be a number of things. Bearing in mind, we had, in this particular case, a stabbing. There'd be traces of blood. The splattering of blood can be important when you try and work out what level of force was used, where the body was, where the assailant was stood. All of these things can be important.
By morning, the whole community was aware something serious had gone on.
There was reports of a lot of police activity. We'd sent reporters and a cameraman down there to go and see what they could find out. We'd had whispers that there had been a murder, so it was obvious that something big had happened.
It was just, you could tell around the place, it was just shock. It was dead quiet. Everybody was stood on the other side of the road trying to figure out what was going on. And literally along here was literally just people just standing there and watching. You had police up and around everywhere.
There were killers in the community, and the clock was ticking. Forensic teams searched for clues as to who these deadly intruders might be.
The door that you can see there opens onto a flat-roofed extension, which has got a felt roof cover. And the window, as on the night in question, 29th of August, would have been open. That's the very window. Open now as it was then.
Eric had a medical condition which caused him breathing difficulties. He would often sleep upright in bed with the window open.
The burglars would have placed a ladder on top of a wheelie bin and climbed onto that flat roof and then gained access to the bedroom where Eric was sleeping in bed with the light on, window open, something that normally you would think that deter burglars from entering.
Burglars breaking into a house when people are asleep is rare, but burglars breaking into a house and murdering somebody in the house is even rarer. And on this occasion, the victim was an elderly man who was bedridden And there would really be no requirement to murder somebody who was sat up in a bed, because he wasn't a threat, physical threat, he couldn't be. The only possibility is that he would have seen the burglars.
And then we got called along to a press conference later on that morning. We were told that there had been a murder, that the victim was an elderly man. At that stage, we didn't know his identity from the police, but of course, from the information that we'd garnered from being on the ground, we realised that it was Eric Hingston. We were told that he'd been killed by intruders who'd come into the house.
Being the victim of a burglary is something everyone dreads. But Eric and Audrey's home had been invaded by people who were willing to kill, and it terrified the whole community.
Murders in Plymouth are rare enough, but stranger murders are incredibly rare. And for something like this to happen, particularly to an older gentleman, it caused shockwaves. You know, we were shocked in the newsroom. The whole of the city of Plymouth was shocked.
It was all over the news, and that was the first time that I think it really hit me, in the sense that it was so close. Even at that age, you could feel the shock and everything going around. Everybody was talking about it, what was going on.
And one thing we wanted to do was A, to obtain information, and B, to provide some sort of community reassurance. And for that purpose, we parked a mobile mini incident room just here where these cars are now, outside the building. It gave people the opportunity to come to talk to the police, to give them information, to receive reassurance from them about the safety of the neighbourhood. When something like this happens, in a community as quiet and peaceful as this, people see burglars and murderers on every corner for several days.
Saturday, 30th of August, the day after the attack, Audrey, who was now staying at her son's house, said she was able to give a detailed description of the two intruders.
She said that she had a good sight of them before disturbing them and then making off.
One of the offenders had a very distinctive appearance, 6 feet 1 inches tall, wearing a deerstalker hat and white trousers, and that she'd seen him around the village on a number of occasions. His partner was a shorter guy, a bit stocky, 5 feet 8 inches tall.
One of the first lines of inquiry that the police gave us as the media was that they had these really clear descriptions of two young men that Audrey had seen come into the house and who were responsible for the attack on Eric.
With the whole community concerned that there were unknown killers at large, the story became nationwide news and the search for suspects intensified.
We had asked whether Audrey would be willing to give a press conference, and we didn't think to start with that she would. But all of a sudden the police came to us and said, actually, Audrey is going to give a press conference. Something that doesn't happen very often, and of course we all went along to it. There were an awful lot of us. The national media had become involved, as well as all of us local reporters, and we were all crammed into a little room. And then Audrey walked in with her son, and then she gave her statement.
During the early hours of Friday morning, 2 men came into my home and ruined my life. My husband Eric did not deserve this. As a frail man, any resistance he put up could easily have been overcome by these 2 young men. There was no need for them to go to the lengths they did.
I remember the room being incredibly quiet. You could hear a pin drop. This doesn't happen very often. Speaking to somebody who'd been there when such a terrible event had happened. And she was just a little old lady, grey hair and glasses. She looked, like your grandma.
Somebody somewhere knows who did this. I ask them, and my family asks them, to please contact the police. If you have any information at all, please pass it to the police. On a personal note, may I thank you for all the love and kindness you've shown us. But please, please do anything you can to help us. Thank you.
On the 1st of September 2003, Audrey Hingston had just given an emotional press conference pleading for information on the 2 male burglars she said killed her husband. Her detailed descriptions of them had been circulated to the media.
It was obviously the lead story on all of the front pages of the newspapers and all of our news programmes that evening.
With all the public attention focused on these suspects, there was a result almost immediately.
They were quickly identified. In fact, having circulated their description, they came forward voluntarily. They were arrested.
We were told that arrests had been made, and we all sort of breathed a bit of a sigh of relief because, it was such a disturbing thing for the whole of the community.
That relief turned out to be short-lived when police questioned the 2 young men.
Inquiries were made into their background, and they didn't fit the profile at all of a burglar or anybody who might have committed this type of offence. They were resident in a bail hostel, which was within half a mile or so of the premises. We looked closely at the opportunity that the 2 guys might have had, but the bail hostel assured us that in accordance with their terms and their procedures, there was no way that these 2 people would have been out at that time of night. And the records showed that. And so, having been interviewed and their alibis substantiated, they were released.
We were all disappointed because clearly that created quite an issue for us, and we were all a bit confused as to why she identified these 2 individuals which clearly couldn't have been responsible.
Apparently these people were quite a common sight in the village. There's a pub next door, there was the butcher's shop and the pasty shop, so it's the sort of place that you'd expect young men to frequent.
The consensus of opinion was she must have seen them earlier that day and recalled seeing them due to the shock.
It felt a lot like the trail had gone cold, and, we made regular calls to the police to try and find out if there were any updates, but there didn't seem to be any. And we were all wondering, are these people ever going to get caught?
Everybody was talking about it. I went to school and you could hear the teachers talking about it when they were having their breaks and that, and everybody was on edge.
The police were working around the clock, and despite the media appeals, there was still no leads. Something wasn't right.
We were looking at a burglary that had gone wrong. We thought it was strange that we didn't find any signs of fingerprints or even glove marks on any of the furniture or drawers that had been ransacked. Forensics found nothing of alien fingerprints or scenes of crime marks at all, which we thought was strange.
As there had been a struggle, police hoped that Eric's killers may have left their DNA on or around his body.
Clearly, this is one of the problems that was created by the paramedics. Quite rightly, of course. They would have been breathing over him, talking over him, touching him. Fibres from their clothes might have fallen onto him. That would have contaminated any type of DNA or fibre evidence that the offenders might have left on him. It took us some time, obviously, to obtain the uniforms and DNA samples from the paramedics.
But once the police lab had managed to identify and separate the traces left by the medical team, there was still no forensic evidence of the offenders inside the flat or out.
And that's one of the things that struck us as strange, because there was no disturbance under the window as you climbed through. No signs of entry, no dirt, no gravel, and it just didn't look right.
Whether somebody was wearing gloves or not, they will leave marks, i.e. you will see where they pulled themselves into a room, if they pulled themselves through a window, you'll see something. Also, if somebody pulls themselves through a window, like in this particular instance, and they're wearing clothing, you would expect them to leave traces or fibres from the clothing on that scene of entry. We didn't get any.
By the 11th of September, Audrey's family were saying that they felt something wasn't right.
A tragic death like Eric's can have far-reaching consequences, and there were real concerns in the family that Audrey was holding something back. the police began to change the focus of their investigation.
Really and truly, at that time, none of us had considered Audrey as a suspect. It was unbelievable at that time. Everything that you'd expect to find from a burglary dwelling, we weren't finding. And then you think back to Audrey's account in the flat about seeing two men, and then you start to think, well, this isn't making sense.
And it's at that stage that we decided that we would have to look very closely at Audrey, because there was no forensics.
But before the police could pay Audrey a visit to find out more, she shocked everybody by attempting suicide. She took an overdose and left a note. Please catch these terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric.
She was detained in Derriford Hospital. Whether this was a real attempt at suicide or whether it was a ploy to put forward a picture of the aggrieved widow who couldn't live without her husband, I'm not sure. But we were also still aware of the family's feelings that Audrey wasn't being truthful, that Audrey was holding something back. And she had been treated for depression by her GP in Plimpton since June of that year, 2 or 3 months earlier, obviously.
Depression can affect someone profoundly. It affects you psychologically, physically. People might have difficulty getting up in the morning. They might struggle with insomnia. They might feel irritable, angry at other times. Hopelessness is something that people often feel. Loss of interest in life in general. They might even engage in reckless behaviour.
With Audrey in a fragile state recovering in hospital, detectives were unable to interview her. But they discreetly continued to investigate whether she was connected to Eric's death and not the burglars she'd claimed.
Bearing in mind, Audrey's son was an ex-police officer, we had to make sure that the information didn't leak out of the police station.
Police were doing a lot of forensic searching in the property. We saw them going in and out all the time.
We had to turn the negative aspects of the lack of forensic evidence into a positive, which is why we decided that we'd reconstruct the alleged entrance to the premises.
We specifically targeted some very, very fit individuals, police officers, to break in to the flat. And we were not surprised to find that they couldn't do it without leaving any trace. Bearing in mind, they tried to break in without leaving any trace of forensic evidence. They couldn't. That reinforced our beliefs that a burglary was pretty much impossible.
Although we'd searched the flat extensively during the early stages, we carried out another search and we found a long 7-inch butcher's knife down the side of the drawers, which is why it had been missed. Eric's post-mortem examination revealed that the cause of death was a single stab wound by a long sharp-bladed instrument which had been forced down past his collarbone, puncturing his lung which had collapsed, and considering his state of health at the time, had led to his death.
They found traces of blood on the blade, which were later forensically examined. DNA came back as Eric's, and there were fingerprints on the knife of Audrey's.
And strangely enough, just the previous week, she had asked James Hingston in the butcher shop to sharpen it for her. And so, eventually, we found the murder weapon.
On the night of Eric's death, Audrey had called 999 at 3:45 a.m. to report the attack.
We located a delivery driver who delivered some goods to the shop at around 2 a.m. the morning Eric was found dead. And he remembered hearing some groaning noises, like somebody was in pain, coming from one of the upstairs windows. Now we know Eric slept in a bedroom with the window open.
So he'd probably been stabbed at or just about that time.
After the post-mortem, we got some more information around the likely time of death, and that was a lot earlier than the telephone call put in by Audrey to the control room.
During this time, Audrey had been opening drawers, scattering their contents around the bedroom, filling a bin liner, possibly even while Eric was lying on the floor, still alive and in great pain.
The evidence was now only pointing in one direction, but it was hard to believe that Audrey could have killed Eric.
There was still a lot of officers who couldn't accept the fact that Audrey was a suspect. There were still people who just couldn't accept that she could have done it.
We had some social workers visit her in hospital, talk to her, and they came back and said something's not right. She wasn't exhibiting any signs of loss or grief. And the social workers picked up on this, as had the family. And so, again, that more or less confirmed our suspicion.
On the 7th of October 2003, Audrey was released from hospital and arrested on suspicion of Eric's murder.
You did feel that there was a lot of people watching. The other thing to remember is Audrey would have been the eldest female suspect arrested for murder. So it was quite a challenge, and we couldn't afford to get it wrong.
Police had taken Audrey Hingston into custody on the suspicion that she had murdered her husband, Eric. They'd found no evidence to back up her claim the crime had been committed by burglars.
We'd been calling the police constantly, asking for updates on the case, but it seemed to have gone very, very quiet. And then all of a sudden, one day, we were making our regular police calls, and they said that Audrey Hingston had been arrested. We were all completely shocked to suddenly be told that this 81-year-old lady who'd given that impassioned appeal at a press conference to find the people that had killed her husband, this little tiny old lady with curly grey hair, apparently done something so cold-blooded to the man that apparently was the love of her life. It was really shocking. We were incredulous.
What we don't know about Audrey is, who is she? I mean, has she shown sparks of aggressive behaviour throughout her life? We don't know. I think the thing is, seeing somebody as old comes with a stereotypical, they have no strength, they are a particular way. There is a perception that 81 years old is too old to commit crime, be violent, be aggressive. Clearly, that is not true.
In her interview at Crown Hill Police Station in Plymouth, Audrey wasn't admitting to anything and came up with yet another explanation.
Audrey then decided Eric must have committed suicide. As a result, she ransacked the flat and made it look like a burglary. She identified two men that she'd seen earlier in the day as being responsible for the burglary because she didn't want to embarrass the family.
As soon as Audrey changed her statement to police, aware the murder weapon had been identified, her son, a former detective, requested to see his mother in custody.
Peter came to the police station. His mother had been in custody some time, and he was with his wife. He wanted to see his mother, and we thought it would be useful if that was allowed. It's not common, but we allowed it.
We're at Crown Hill Police Station. This is the custody suite where Audrey would have been at the time she was under arrest. Her son and her son's family came to visit her, and they had that conversation with her, and that's when Audrey told her son that she did in fact kill Eric.
Any relationship can become difficult or strained, but it's hard to imagine a situation where the only way out was to kill your partner.
She apparently fed up of caring for him. See, previously, Eric had been in good health. They had a car, they had a good social life, they travelled out a lot, they visited, local beauty spots, pubs, sandwich, and this had all disappeared. And this is this had caused the depression, and this is what culminated in the murder of Eric.
Without speaking to Audrey, we don't know what led to her breaking point. She may have felt frustrated, resentful, stressed, distressed, unable to ask for help, feeling that she'd lost her partner, going through in her mind what might have felt like a living bereavement. This is not the future I'd planned. He's become sick. Instead of going out and enjoying ourselves, he can't do what I hoped he could do with me. And that sense of frustration might have been bottled up until she finally blew.
Audrey's family now knew the truth, but police needed an official record of the confession, and this responsibility fell to her son.
I then said to him, Pete, I need a statement from you about what your mother said. Are you prepared to give me one? And he said, yeah, I don't want her looking silly.
I had a lot of sympathy for Peter and his family. It must have been awfully embarrassing for Peter, and I felt that for him.
I had to take my hat off to him because he did the right thing. But it must have been difficult.
For Audrey's family, it's incredibly shattering to discover that, their family member has committed such a crime, and they've literally got to rewrite their understanding of that person. It's incredibly painful. Everything you thought you knew about that person isn't anymore. You almost feel alienated from them.
Audrey Hingston could now be formally charged with the murder of her husband, Eric.
It was such a shock to hear that she'd been charged, but then to find out that she had actually confessed to killing Eric. Well, there was huge disbelief in the community. Nobody could believe that this little old lady could have done something so terrible.
Shocked. I was shocked. I think there was a lot of people that there was relief, because obviously at the time it was supposed to be a burglar. So I think, for as bad as it sounds, I think a lot of people were relieved. But there was still that shock that it was so close.
I spent a long time talking to Eric's family, to his son and daughter-in-law. They all lived and worked very closely together. They were very upset, very, very upset, particularly thinking about the way that she was willing to point the finger at two young men, give very accurate descriptions of two people who were then picked up and arrested, that she was willing to literally let them take the blame for what had happened. They really feel that she was an incredibly calculating woman.
It's, if you like, a double violation. First, you take away somebody we love, and then second of all, you lie to cover up your own guilt, to cover your tracks in such detail, to play the victim, speaks to quite a character from my point of view. But it's her age, the life stage, the violence and the lying that are an interesting cluster for me, and very surprising.
On the 3rd of December 2003, Eric Hingston was laid to rest alongside his first wife, Jean. 3 months later, on the 12th of March 2004, his second wife, Audrey, appeared at Plymouth Crown Court to answer for his death.
It was downgraded to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. I think in view of her age, her history of depression, and the fact that she didn't present any danger to the public, it was not going to please everybody, particularly not the Hingston family.
So this is Plymouth Crown Court. We were expecting to come here for a trial to start, something that was possibly 2 or 3 weeks long. And in fact, it all happened in just one day. It was a plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. So actually, in the courtroom, there weren't very many people, not even Eric's own family, because they didn't expect it to happen either.
Eric's family weren't happy with the way the court case went.
So one of the things that happened as part of this court hearing was that there was a victim impact statement read to the court. On behalf of Eric's family, Jimmy Hingston gave that statement, but he actually gave it at a time when he still thought that Audrey was a victim. So it was fairly sympathetic to her and the work that she'd done in looking after Eric. If they'd given a different witness impact statement, that was after they found out that Audrey had been charged with his killing, it might have been very different.
Audrey Hingston was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and sentenced to 2 years in prison.
I think she was very lucky to get away with manslaughter in 2 years.
As far as Eric's family are concerned, they felt that the sentence was very lenient. They weren't able to give their say. They weren't even told that it was happening on that day, so they didn't come. They didn't see Audrey for that final time. They did appeal against the sentence to try and get it increased, but it never was. And I think that Eric's family certainly feel that they didn't get justice for him in this courtroom.
In 2004, aged 81, Audrey Hingston became the oldest woman to be jailed in Britain. She served 1 year of her sentence before she was released. She died 12 years later in 2016.
I've covered an awful lot of murder trials in my time and horrendous cases, but this one has always lived with me. I think partly because we were also taken in by Audrey from the beginning. You know, you don't see very many elderly ladies giving press conferences like that. And, you know, we all felt like we'd been hoodwinked by her, I suppose. And in particular, the fact that she only served a year for taking the life of Eric just felt like a slap in the face for the Hingston family.
I understand that she was under probably quite a lot of mental pressure. However, if there was a cry for help, ask for help. It's rather extreme to stab your husband when he's asleep in bed.
You've got here a man who'd flown missions into Europe during the war. He'd been a businessman, a licensee, a butcher, worked hard all his life. To end it like this was not, I'm sure, not the way that he would have expected to die, and wasn't right. And I don't think he did get justice. No.
For Eric and Audrey Hingston, his illness changed everything. And incredibly, the only way out for Audrey was to commit the unthinkable.
Attracted by the finer things in life. You look shattered and he's broke, and all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you, and the fine line between wrong and right.
When you're part of a close-knit community that shares the same values and way of life, where everybody knows everybody, you'd think you would be safe and secure. But you never know what can happen behind closed doors.
When I heard about this young woman who'd gone missing, I was struck by how unusual an event this was. Police launched a proof of life investigation.
The name Proof of Life sounds encouraging. We were basically trying to establish if a person is dead.
The Scottish coast, with picturesque towns and quiet, calm locations. The last place you'd expect to uncover a story of abuse, neglect, and murder.
Intricate What a lovely location to live in. Sitting on the banks of the Clyde, overlooking the Argyll Hills and the forest on the other side of the river. And it always struck me as somewhere that would have been a lovely place to have grown up.
You would be very pleased if you got a house here with this sea view. So you don't believe that people go missing and never be found again. It's not a place that you would think anything like this would happen.
In the early 1990s, this idyllic area was home to the Fleming family and their daughter Margaret.
Margaret Fleming was the only child of Margaret and Derek Fleming. I think she was a very, very quiet child. She needed a lot of support in school.
Margaret had learning difficulties growing up, which wasn't diagnosed until later. At primary school, it was identified that she had problems with reading and writing, which later were revealed as learning difficulties. And this would have had an impact on friendships and how she related to other people and how other people related to her.
The family lived in the town of Port Glasgow, 10 miles along the coast from Inverkip. In January 1993, Margaret's parents divorced. Margaret was a vulnerable young woman, and now her world had been turned entirely upside down.
When Margaret was about 12 or so, she didn't get on with her mother particularly, so she moved in with her father and his parents.
She was very closely bonded to her father. She had quite a fractious relationship with her mum, but her and her dad were a little unit.
Margaret's father, Derek, was a tradesman who had retrained as a lawyer. He then met Jean.
I think we were about 3 years together. I didn't like him at first. He was a lawyer. And then he says, "Oh, come on, I'll take you for a coffee." I went, "Aye, all right then." And we got on all right.
As she got to know Derek better, Jean saw his relationship with daughter Margaret firsthand.
Always together. Really. And wherever Derek was, Margaret was there. And it was lovely to see. She's quite shy, reserved. She'd take a while to get to know you. But when she did, she did. She clung on to you. She was really a nice little kid.
Jean and Derek eventually got engaged and started to make plans together, always making sure to include daughter Margaret.
And her dad told her we were going to get married. How do you feel about that? Well, she was a wee bit unsure about it at first. And I turned and said, "I ain't going to take your mum's place. Nothing's going to change." And she was quite happy about it. Unfortunately, her dad had cancer.
All parents worry about what they would do if they were unable to look after their children, and Margaret's father was no different. He had to find the right people to step in if the worst happened.
When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, one of Derek's greatest worries was who would care for Margaret once he died. Fortunately, some of his stresses were alleviated when a couple came forward and voluntarily agreed to care for Miss Fleming.
The couple were Edward Kearney and Avril Jones. Derek had got to know them after doing some legal work for Kearney.
He said he'd known him for years, he trusted him and that, and I said, well, at the time I said to him, I don't like him. I said, I've got a gut feeling.
Edward Kearney was thought to have had his finger in many pies, business-wise, in that local area. He was a fully qualified deep-sea diver and practiced that career, which is well paid because of the enormous risks attached to it. So he's a man who had a physical presence, a physically strong man. Some people who had dealings with him would find him intimidating, and I mean that simply by his presence. As for Avril Jones, she was a secretary to a law firm in the area for many years and pursued a perfectly legitimate and ordinary life.
Margaret's father didn't feel that his parents could really cope with Margaret and felt that perhaps Edward and Avril could look after her better.
You know you're ill, You've made a connection with these two people who you've put your trust in, and to give your child over suggests that he really believed that they would take really good care of her and have her back.
Derek made the couple Margaret's legal guardians in his will. Sadly, his illness progressed very quickly.
We were going to get married. He fell ill, went to doctors, and within 8 weeks, he was dead. From the day he went into hospital, I never went home. I never left. I sat there beside him until he passed away.
After Derek's death, while his estate was sorted out, Margaret stayed with family in order to limit even more disruption to her life.
When her father died, she was absolutely distraught, really bereft. She had lost somebody who, well, perhaps the only person who really loved her.
She went with her grandparents at first. They were devastated when Derek died. It was their only child. It was sad. Margaret, she'd taken it really bad when her dad went away. Both Derek's parents then went into a care home because they were too old to look after themselves.
At this point, Avril Jones and Edward Kearney stepped forward to look after Margaret, now 16. Jean had no choice but to let Margaret go. But she was not convinced about the couple. There was an age difference of 18 years between Avril Jones and Edward Kearney.
A few times I had to go out there with Derek. I just didn't like the guy. Avril wasn't that bad, but she was controlled by him.
In 1997, 16-year-old Margaret went to live with Edward Kearney and Avril Jones at their home in Inverkip. It seemed Jean wasn't the only person unhappy with the arrangement.
At one point, Margaret's mother did turn up to the house and said that she wanted Margaret to come back home and live with her.
There had been a furious row, and Kearney had made some threats, and in fact, she accused him of relatively low-level violence towards her. He demanded of Margaret, who was in the house when this was going on, who do you want to live with, us or her? And Margaret elected to stay with them.
I get the sense that she was frightened of Edward and probably Avril, and maybe she felt she had no other option but to say, I want to stay here.
It's hard to imagine how Margaret felt, but as she became more reclusive, she also became more isolated from those around her.
Kenny was clearly an individual who was controlling and dominating, always wanted to be in control of himself, his emotions, and his surroundings. When he was unable to successfully do this, what he would tend to do is be confrontational and retaliate.
Margaret Fleming had been living with Avril Jones and Edward Kearney since 1997, and they had cut all ties with the teenagers' family and friends.
We never had any contact with Margaret, and that was even including Margaret's mother. They said Margaret didn't want nothing at all to do with us. Don't phone the house again, don't get in contact in any way or form. And that's what I done. I used to wonder, would she come and get in contact? Because I still had the same house phone number. I never changed it. She never phoned.
There was an occasion at a family celebration when Avril's brother and family had come up to Inverkip, and he heard this horrible moaning sound from within the house as he was speaking to his sister outside in the garden, and looking up and seeing Margaret, who appeared to have 2 lengths of cardboard tubing or guttering, some kind of cylindrical covering on her arms, and clearly distressed.
Avril's brother was told the tubing was to protect Margaret from self-harming.
Then there was a Christmas dinner where the Joneses family got together, but Margaret wasn't at that dinner. There were photographs taken, but Margaret wasn't in them, which just struck me as odd. Would they not be asking, where's Margaret?
Margaret appeared to have vanished from sight, and it seemed no one was looking for her. In fact, no one would even inquire about Margaret's whereabouts for almost 17 years.
I didn't leave her. I was told she didn't want anything to do with me. And I wondered what she was up to. Did she get married? Did she have a family? You know. I did think Margaret would have come to me if there was anything wasn't gone right. You know, that she would get in contact with me. She never saw. I thought her life was good.
Nobody heard from Kearney and Jones till 2016, when the Department for Work and Pensions received a new application for welfare payments from Avril on behalf of Margaret.
Avril Jones had been in receipt of benefit as being a carer for Margaret. The benefit system changed, so she had to reapply for a new kind of benefit called personal independence payment.
She requested more financial support. In the application, she stated that Margaret needed more care and attention.
Margaret would now be 35, and it appeared that in the last 17 years, her condition had badly deteriorated.
There was a list of things which indicated that Margaret was literally incapable of looking after herself even for a moment, couldn't be left on her own, she couldn't be trusted. She wasn't allowed into the kitchen where the dogs were because she had been found eating out of the dog's bowl. This raised eyebrows, as you might expect.
A local social worker telephoned Avril Jones to find out more.
Avril indicated that there was no way Margaret would speak to anyone or attend any appointment to be assessed because she was so terrified of authority and wouldn't leave the house.
But the social worker refused to be fobbed off.
She went straight round to the house herself without any answer. And at that, the concerns were so great in the mind of the social worker that she made an urgent referral to the police.
Late afternoon that same day, the 28th of October 2016, 2 police officers pulled up in a marked car at Avril Jones and Edward Kearney's home.
For obvious reasons, it was important that Margaret be seen and her well-being determined. They were able to see 2 figures moving towards the door after they had knocked the door. They then retreated, and one person came to answer the door, this being Avril. The officers were given access to the house. They found the most bizarre setup in the house with junk everywhere.
They were actually struck by the state the property was in. It was a very dilapidated house, very, very run down.
They went into the living room with Avril, who had immediately explained that she was the only person in the house and that Edward was out walking with Margaret. Now, the weather conditions were such that that was immediately unlikely. The female officer glanced out of the living room along a corridor which leads to the kitchen and saw, as it turns out, Edward Kearney kind of pressed in against the wall, she thought, as if trying to conceal himself, but able to hear what was going on in the living room. He'd clearly been there the whole time. And so one of the officers then said to Avril Jones, well, is that him there? And she feigned surprise that he was in the house. They asked the question, well, where's Margaret? She's in the kitchen, he said, making a show of opening the door, and then, as if startled and surprised, she's run away. She's gone.
When I heard about this young woman who'd gone missing, it did really intrigue me, because I knew the area where nothing much really happened, nothing much that was bad anyway. It was quite a community-orientated place. People seemed to look out for each other, and I was struck by how unusual an event this was.
The police had launched a missing persons investigation to look for Margaret Fleming, but soon discovered it wasn't going to be a straightforward case.
I would find it very hard to run away anywhere around here, because you've got this main road, which is really dangerous and very busy, and then you've got the sea on the other side.
Because of the concerns for this vulnerable person, very quickly additional officers started arriving. And after a short time, CID officers were asked to attend as well. And so they asked Avril and Eddie repeatedly for detail as to where she had been, why she had fled, what had been happening. And it obviously struck Kearney quite quickly that the police weren't accepting this story. And he called out, "You know where this is heading, Avril, this will end up as a murder charge." Which seemed a distinctly odd thing to say if all that had happened was that the girl or woman in their care had run away minutes earlier.
Police immediately started tracing anybody previously involved in Margaret's life who might know anything about her whereabouts. Jean hadn't seen her since the late 1990s.
CID come to my house and they asked me, did I know Margaret Fleming? I went, "Oh, don't tell me they've done her in." That was my exact words. "Oh no, she's just missing." I actually nearly collapsed. And I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't sleep for weeks, because I never heard anything. But as soon as the CID came, Andrew, I'm sorry.
Looking at the state of Jones and Kearney's home, detectives feared clues to Margaret's fate lay inside rather than outside.
The condition that that house was in was such, it was unlivable. It was a mess. It was contaminated with all sorts of stuff. What we'd be looking for here would be traces of Margaret in the house. Is there anything that indicates that she'd come to some sort of harm?
The detectives searched every inch of the house. They did not want to miss any evidence that would shed light on the miserable ordeal suffered by Margaret.
The police spent quite a time there trying to see any evidence at all that Margaret had been living there as they claimed. So, for example, are there any of her belongings here? Nothing. Toothbrush, even. No, she carries everything in a bag that she carries with her all the time, according to Avril.
They dug the garden, they searched the home, which I think was a very complex operation because the house was just full of rubbish. I think for the first time in Police Scotland's history, they set up a mobile laboratory in the couple's garden so they could test and analyse each item that came out of the house.
Everything that was handed over as being Margaret's was either Eddie's or Avril's, and when subjected to scientific examination, revealed no trace of Margaret's DNA.
Of all the thousands of objects that they tested, there was no sign of Margaret being there.
And that is something that is strange. And that is something that makes you think, has there been cover-up? Or has harm come to her some time ago? There was no forensic evidence to show that Margaret was in that house. But there was evidence from witnesses that speak to her being there, albeit some time ago. And that's important. So she was definitely in that house. She was there, it's just that she disappeared off the radar. And the only people that were there were these two carers.
In 2016, a search was on for a vulnerable woman, Margaret Fleming, who had gone missing. Her carers, Edward Kearney and Avril Jones, told police that she'd only recently run away. But a forensic examination of their house revealed no trace of her living there at all. Police feared a cover-up. Officers carried out an extensive physical search for Margaret and found nothing. But they weren't prepared to give up.
From quite an early stage, it was so obvious that the inability to find Margaret safe and well at that time was likely to be related to criminality rather than missing person. But there is a process through which the senior investigating officer must go before declaring a criminal inquiry.
When police interviewed Avril Jones's mother about Margaret's possible whereabouts, she immediately shot a big hole through the couple's version of events.
Avril's mother was astonished at the notion that the police would expect to find Margaret there because, as far as she was concerned, many years ago, Margaret had gone and had never been back.
There was a phone call between Avril Jones and her mother about 5th of January 2000. Avril had told her mother that Margaret had gone off and had disappeared.
Avril had said to her mother that Margaret, who would have been 19 at the time, had left with the traveller.
The very idea that Avril's mother, who lives nearby, was telling the police, Margaret's not here and has not been here for years, whereas Eddie and Avril were saying she was here 10 minutes ago, didn't gel. It was pretty obvious, I think, that Margaret hadn't been there. There was a lie being told about her and that there had been a lot of money paid out of the taxpayer's pocket on the basis that Margaret was there and being cared for. So it was very obvious that at the very least a benefit fraud had been committed.
Looking for Margaret was like searching for a ghost.
You had no phone data, you had no forensic evidence, no one had been in contact with Margaret for all those years, and then these two, her carers, were leading police to believe that she disappeared. So really, all the lines of inquiry around Margaret had dried up. They had nothing to go on.
Police launched a proof of life investigation. They made a public appeal to see if anybody across the UK had heard of Margaret, or come across Margaret, knew of Margaret.
The name Proof of Life sounds encouraging. But you're basically trying to establish if a person is dead.
They contacted all the GPs in the whole of the UK, all the health boards, all education authorities, to see if there was any trace of her. They made inquiries with banks and credit companies, but there was absolutely no sign of her on social media either. No digital footprint, which is unusual, for the days that we live in.
The police knew it would be hard to prove Margaret had come to some harm without finding her body.
The area around the house where they were living, Kearney and Jones, huge amount of land, trying to search for that body. Diggers, they looked in the river, they had divers, everything they could do. They had a drone up trying to identify an area where she could be buried. I mean, that's a mammoth task. And really, Kearney and Jones gave them nothing to go on.
The house is very secluded, so anything that would have happened there, or, if you like your privacy, that's where you would have your house. Because the only people that can see you is from the sea. There might be a boat passing, but other than that, nobody would see you.
It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, trying to find Margaret Fleming. The only time you can prove she was alive was when she was last sighted on the 17th of December 1999, when Avril Jones' brother says he last saw her.
The investigation into Margaret's disappearance made it clear that no one had seen her since 1999, and the only two people that could account for her whereabouts were Kearney and Jones, and their stories weren't adding up.
I wouldn't even look at a newspaper. I wouldn't look at nothing, because I couldn't. I just crumble all the time.
There'd been stuff in the press, and a lot of it was negative. We knew there was a bigger story here. We were just basically trying to find it.
In 2017, 1 year into the police missing persons investigation, one of photojournalist George Wright's colleagues in the media posted a card through Kearney and Jones' letterbox asking for an interview.
About a week later, after he put the card through the door, that he got a phone call. And they wanted to tell their side of things, because they felt like everything was on them, everybody was against them.
On the 4th of October, George and his colleague went to interview Kearney and Jones.
Memories that are bringing back is a wee bit of trepidation going up to the house, just wondering what it was going to be like in there. because we've seen it from the road. It looked really run down and dark and dank, and it was, definitely. So this is bringing it all back again. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to get, if anything. They might have just said no at the time and we wouldn't have got anything, but we spoke to Edward on the doorstep and he eventually let us in.
He basically just asked him, well, where is Margaret? Tell us what happened. The story that they then came away with was so fantastical that at one point I was trying not to laugh because it was just unbelievable.
They actually said she was working as a gangmaster and she was running organised people trafficking and things like that.
And she was getting them to commit criminal acts for her, and she was the head of an organisation. But then 5 minutes before that, they had said that she was quite slow and she wasn't that bright.
Edward Kearney tended to want to take control. He wanted to do all the talking and not let, I think, Avril Jones speak at all.
They were actually asked on that interview, how did they feel that she's not appeared?
Normally, interviewees will say, well, please come home, give me a call. Even if we've had an argument, I want to hear from you. That's the sort of thing people tend to say in this situation.
They actually were quite vociferous. They didn't really like her. She was connected in drugs, she was involved in all sorts of things like that. So they were being quite nasty about Margaret.
I was raging. How dare you? Wrong. No. Margaret wasn't a gangster. She'd never get involved with MD like that. He just went to cover his back.
This is what it is now. Just boarded up. I was actually glad to get out the house and actually get some fresh air because all the windows were bolted shut. There was no air in the house at all. It was horrible. All you were breathing in was dust and dirt. And then Edward showed us painstakingly where the police had dug up quite a lot of the garden. I don't know why he was telling us that. I think he was wanting to feel sorry for him. You know, look what they've done to my garden. They've dug it all up. Well, there's been good reason why it was dug up.
And with the interview, Kearney and Jones were digging themselves deeper into trouble.
After that, things just snowballed very, very quickly. The investigation was ongoing by that point. Police kept it really quiet. I think the police were watching for any discrepancies in what they were telling us and them.
They gave different accounts at different times, but the recurring theme was that in the first week in January of 2000, she had gone away with someone from the travelling community and was living in Cumbria with travelling people. They then finessed the account to include that she would come back very frequently to collect the money that was hers. They obviously had worked out they still had to pretend that they were not the beneficiaries of this money, that in fact Margaret was still getting it. And this was part of the hole they were digging for themselves. Because it meant that since they were insisting on that, if we were able to prove that wasn't right, it greatly undermined any credibility their account might have.
Police believe that Margaret died sometime between the 17th of December 1999 and the 5th of January 2000. She would have just been 19 at the time.
In an attempt to counter this theory, Kearney and Jones produced letters they claimed were from Margaret to prove she had left their house alive and well. Apparently signed and dated between the 9th and 13th of January 2000, the first was posted in Carlisle and the other two were from the Regent Palace Hotel in London.
Margaret had difficulties with numeracy and literacy. One of her teachers had said that she had a reading age of about 8 and would really not have been able to write the letters that they said she had written.
Spelling and grammatical errors were deliberately generated to give the impression that they had been written by someone who was not very good at writing English. The letters were typed and sent, one from the English-Scottish border and 2 from London. The significance of the one from the border is that it would have been on the route that Kearney and Jones would have taken to travel down to London, that they were laying a false trail of letters sent by Margaret to explain that she wasn't coming back.
Ironically, Avril Jones's log of another form of correspondence would later back up the police's theory about the period in which Margaret died.
Avril Jones kept this Christmas card book, which is a sort of odd thing to do. Don't know anybody else. I've never come across anybody who keeps their Christmas card book. And she would tick off people who had sent her cards, but also who she had sent cards to. And there was a tick on Margaret's name for 1997, 1998, 1999. But after that, there was no tick for any year subsequently.
With the investigation cranking up the pressure on them, Kearney and Jones were about to crack.
They were ready to go. Kearney and Jones were about to board a train. They had a large sum of money. They were going. The heat was on them, and they were heading on a train down south when they were arrested by the police.
On October 26, 2017, Edward Kearney and Avril Jones were interviewed at Govan Police Station in Glasgow on the suspicion of murdering missing woman Margaret Fleming way back in 1999 when she was 19 and they were supposed to be caring for her.
They were interviewed simultaneously. Kearney's response at interview was really quite farcical. He initially endeavoured to say no comment, but very quickly descended into personal abuse against the interviewing officer, clearly trying his best to unsettle him and avoid answering any relevant questions. He's a very, very arrogant man and insisted that Margaret was very much still alive and active.
Despite Kearney's bravado and Jones' silence, the evidence was mounting against the pair.
Avril, on the other hand, maintained no comment answers, but became upset a couple of times and insisted, for example, that Eddie knows where Margaret is. That was quite a telling point. But when tested or probed on the truth of what was happening with her benefit money, for example, and how often she would collect it, she was unable to be convincing at all about those sort of details.
The next day, Kearney and Jones were charged with Margaret's murder and were remanded in custody. As the news broke, the public was shocked as to how the couple had managed to hold their dark secret for 17 years.
People were really horrified about what had happened. There was probably a sense of guilt in the small village of Inverkip that Margaret had lived there, had disappeared, and nobody realised.
She never had a chance, did she? From the time the CID came to my door, I've never been. I have a lot of regrets. Could I have done more to get Margaret? I really feel I let her down because I feel I never fought hard enough for it.
Margaret was really isolated from other people who loved and cared about her. And that feels incredibly tragic, that no one actually checked to see where she was and actually to see her face to face, but just believed the narrative that they were being given.
Margaret was simply a forgotten person. She was an individual that was vulnerable. We have this notion that because they're receiving guardianship and that they're receiving financial support from the state, that their well-being is catered for and looked after. Yet they're some of the most overlooked and neglected individuals.
Margaret had fallen through a crack in the system. Nobody, from the council or any other departments, social work and whatever, asked about her welfare or anything. Margaret being a missing person only came to light when the benefit system changed. But they've been claiming money for Margaret for years and years and years.
Something like £180,000, and the money had gone into Avril Jones's account as Margaret's carer. The couple did have some financial problems. They were found to have been in mortgage arrears. So there's a theory that they actually invited Margaret into the house deliberately in order to claim her benefits.
A person who's able to lie so elaborately about the killing of someone is clearly an individual who has depersonalized and dehumanized the victim. They consider the victim as an object. As such, they've been able to objectify their killing for just money.
Do you know, that's hard. That's very hard to accept another human being could do that to another kid. You know, a kid. That's bad. That's evil. Really evil.
On April 25th, 2019, 77-year-old Edward Kearney and 59-year-old Avril Jones went on trial at the High Court in Glasgow, accused of murdering Margaret Fleming.
Without having a body, to get a conviction for a murder, although it's not unheard of, it is one of the most difficult cases. No DNA, no forensic, you have no idea how the victim met their death.
But there was still plenty of evidence in this case. There was no proof of life. Margaret was not living. There was a Christmas card book which was ticked off for the years. That stopped in 1999. There was inconsistency in statements. They produced false information that she was still alive. They were writing letters.
Focus then came to be on what was going on in London on 13th of January 2000, and that was the date on one of the letters. Kearney and Jones were real hoarders. They did not throw anything away. And that turns out, on the one hand, they say, well, we don't throw anything away, and that's why we've still got those letters from Margaret. I'm glad we didn't throw them away because we can prove she was alive and well. Nor did they, however, throw away the invoice from the Regent Palace Hotel showing that a couple in the name of Jones had stayed there on the 13th of January 2000.
This meant Kearney and Jones happened to be staying in the exact same hotel on the exact same night that Margaret had supposedly been there and written a letter to them to explain her disappearance.
Without that, I'm not convinced there would have been a case. To find that invoice, that was a real stroke of luck. It's an astonishing mistake to have made.
Edward Kearney did himself few favours either when Ian McSporran cross-examined him.
He started contradicting things he had previously said, quite significant contradictions. It was a bit like nailing jelly to a wall. If one story didn't turn out to be any good, he would change it to another story. And since the two of them had twined their fate, really, although Avril Jones didn't give evidence, the damage he was doing to her as well. She maintained a fixed gaze forward for almost all of the trial. There were no betrayal of emotions.
There were so many inconsistencies, and there was no doubt when this was all presented together that Margaret had been killed by these two.
The jury found Edward Kearney and Avril Jones guilty of Margaret Fleming's murder. Both were also convicted of perverting the course of justice, and Jones was additionally convicted of fraudulently claiming £182,000 in benefits.
The reality is, criminal geniuses are very few and far between. The jails are full of people who aren't as clever as they thought they were.
Jones and Kearney were each sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years.
They've never admitted to murdering the young women they were supposed to be looking after. And Margaret's body's never been found.
You'll find her in the bottom of the sea. I'm still convinced of it. Nothing will change me. She's at the bottom of the sea.
When killers don't confess to the crimes that they've committed, nor do they tell authorities where their victim's body is located, this for many is their last form of control. We know that Kearney is an individual who liked to be dominating, and as such, this is one of the last forms of control that he has over authorities, over the victim, and over the victim's family.
What happened to Margaret is an unfinished, incomplete story. And psychologically, that can be deeply, deeply painful. Where is she? What happened? How did she die? We can't even bury her. We can't even honour the life that she had. So all these questions remain questions for the rest of their lives until these two people decide whether they're going to speak out or not.
But sometimes allegiances change. You never know. As Kearney's older, if he died first, who knows, Avril Jones might be able to tell the police in Scotland where Margaret Fleming's body is, to give them closure and do the decent things so they can bury Margaret.
Margaret's story is heartbreaking. She was a vulnerable woman who needed support, and the very people who were meant to be her protectors ended up betraying her in the most unimaginable way.
Margaret came from Port Glasgow. I want to get a bench to be put up in the shopping centre and get a plaque put on it for her so that she'll never, ever be forgotten. I wanted to bring her up as mine. She would have had a good life. Oh, she would have had a good life.
Distracted by the finer things in life. He looks shattered and he's broke. And all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you. And the fine line between wrong and right.
The old saying goes, your home is your castle. The door closes behind you. It's where you feel safe. So when violence erupts inside, it's all the more shocking. In 2011, in an affluent part of London, a quiet local man was found dead in his bedroom.
You can sometimes go to someone's address and you can find money in a drawer, in a wallet, or in a jacket pocket. But you don't tend to find thousands and thousands of pounds just lying around in bin liners or shopping bags.
If you find out how somebody lives, you stand a better chance of understanding why it is that they may have died.
When you live alone and you need help, you often have no choice but to let others into your life and home. But who you choose to admit can mean the difference between life and death.
Brook Green is, I would say, an affluent area. It's bordered by Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith, so just a typically kind of diverse London locale. Expensive houses, expensive property, nice restaurants, nice pubs.
It's a nice area. So murder, in fact any crime around here, is probably quite unusual.
Brook Green in West London was home to 58-year-old William John Saunderson Smith.
William grew up in Rugby in Warwickshire. I think his father died when he was around about 8, and then shortly after his mother was taken away to a mental institution. So he had a difficult upbringing.
William grew up with his cousin because his father died and his mother was taken into hospital because she had mental health problems. And this is quite a difficult and challenging start to life. And these things influence and affect and shape your worldview. May have left him feeling, that the world is not a safe place.
He had actually come from a tenant farmer background, and his family had money, but they were farmers. But then he had at some point decided to come to London to make his own fortune, and he certainly did that.
William had spent his money wisely, investing in property and making a living as a landlord.
He had a large portfolio of properties that he was renting out, particularly or primarily in the West London area. The majority of the properties that he was renting out in the London area, they were normally to Aussies or to Kiwis. And it's probably because of the transient nature of those individuals and because they would be working in the area for his court, he seemed to have a ready market that he was obviously supplying with accommodation to stay. He was obviously a wealthy individual.
While William was well off, it seemed he was not so comfortable with the outside world, and there was no sign of really close relationships.
William didn't have a big family. His parents died long ago. He had no spouse, no children.
William had had a difficult start in life, so unsurprisingly, he kept his life private. But to others, this privacy was unsettling.
He led quite a complex lifestyle. When he was having these properties renovated, he'd often fall out with the builders, owing them a lot of money. So the builders were trying to get hold of him. When he rented his properties out, he would often keep the deposits and they would try and get hold of him as well. So it was quite a complex character in that he owed a lot of people a lot of money, but he made it very difficult for them to track him down.
From what we understand, somebody who's pretty difficult as a landlord and, would use cheaper builders rather than spend the money. And for me, psychologically, this possibly speaks to somebody who saw holding on to money as a form of security, almost like a blanket of protection.
The jewel in the crown of the Saunderson Smiths' property empire was a large terraced townhouse in Brook Green. All of a sudden, in 2011, he evicted the students living there and moved himself in.
Although he was a multimillionaire, he didn't necessarily live an outward-facing, flamboyant millionaire's lifestyle. Rather, he was quite recluse, clandestine, and kept a very low profile.
The house in Brook Green became not only William's home, but also his biggest building project.
The property was in a huge state of renovation. On every single one of the 4 floors, there was building materials. He was doing it up.
His builders, he had entrusted them, I believe, on several of his building projects.
The property at the time, even back in 2011, whilst it was being done up, was probably worth in the region of £2 million.
Although residents on the road suspected William was perhaps converting it back to a family house, they barely saw their new neighbour. To some people, he was William Saunderson Smith. To others, he was simply known as John, his middle name. Being a local landlord kept him busy.
He took a lot of money in rent. He charged a lot of people the upfront deposit, but always collect the money in cash.
He spent most of his time visiting these different addresses, collecting his rent. He didn't really take much of the money to the bank.
And he had all this money, and over years and years, he led quite a reclusive lifestyle, so he had no real major means of spending this money. And so the money just built up. And this business model worked for a very long time, until the banks clamped down on exactly where this cash was coming from, money laundering regulations, etc. And all of a sudden, he had all this cash, but there was nowhere for him to put it.
With the constant building work at his home, keeping track of his business started to get too much, and William John finally admitted he needed some help.
John hired an assistant on Gumtree, and this young lad, his job really was to try and put his finances in order and some sort of semblance of normality to his accounts.
William had started to let people into his life, but one morning it became clear that something wasn't right. On Friday, 21st of October 2011, he had arranged a meeting with the young assistant he'd hired.
On the morning he was supposed to meet with John. John didn't turn up. And so we came to the house. And because it was being done up, there was a newly painted sash window on the left of the door. And there was a clear mark on there that had been jemmied with a screwdriver or something similar. And the PA went inside and found John's lifeless body upstairs in a state of undress on the very top floor.
On Friday the 21st of October, William John Saunderson Smith had been discovered in the attic bedroom of his 4-storey house in Brook Green, London.
I was informed on the late Friday evening that William Saunderson Smith had been found battered about the head in his attic room. He was naked from the waist down. It would appear as if there was obviously a struggle in his attic room at the time. Therefore, that's where we started the investigation.
Detective Chief Inspector Howard Groves of the Met's Homicide and Serious Crime Command was appointed as the senior investigating officer on the case.
I visited the vicinity of the crime scene, but I didn't enter the crime scene. Sometimes when we watch television programs, we see the detectives in the murder scene walking around, picking up items and drawing crayon markings around the body and all those things. In reality, it doesn't happen like that. I don't want to go into a scene and contaminate it. Once the investigators, in terms of forensics, have completed their job, then I would go into the scene.
Detective Inspector John Finch was also on the team.
In the initial stages of a murder investigation, it looks like organised chaos. Everybody's got a job. You appoint your exhibits officers, your family liaison officers, house-to-house, telephones officers. Everybody's got a job. To an outsider, it might look a bit disorganised. But we held a team meeting, told everybody what we knew at this moment in time, set everybody their tasks, and they set about investigating the murder.
There wasn't any shops. It was just completely residential street. So did any neighbour hear or see anything unusual? A lot of people nowadays have CCTV on their front door, but it's still able to see the street sometimes from that. We knew that although it was a residential street, within 20 yards of that junction, there was a main road. And therefore, there should have been CCTV that would have either shown vehicles entering or leaving.
William lived alone, and there were signs of a break-in on one of the downstairs windows. What was immediately obvious was that, judging by the freshness of the blood and William's injuries, he had been killed in the last 24 hours.
The unusual thing about this case from the outset, I remember saying to my staff, we've got a whodunit because we knew where it happened and we knew roughly when it happened in terms of time, but we didn't know who committed the offence and why. So it was going to be taxing and demanding on us.
With so much police activity in the area, word soon spread.
I think someone had tweeted me that there was quite a lot of police activity. Our offices were only a couple of minutes walk away, and I remember talking to officers to find out exactly what had happened, and the early kind of answer was that someone had been killed in the building.
When we started investigating, we realised it wasn't going to be quite a straightforward murder investigation. One of the first things you do in a murder investigation is do your house-to-house inquiries. When we spoke to one of the immediate neighbours, they said that they heard sounds that they believe was people running up and down the stairs in the early hours of the morning, and that itself was very out of character and strange.
As police began to look into William's life, it became clear he was a bit of a recluse and had few friends in the area.
We had difficulty in identifying any next of kin. That took us some 3 weeks before we could identify someone. Normally, when you have an investigation, you will have a family liaison officer that is assigned to the family to keep them updated on the investigation. And we had to use a friend to do that because we couldn't identify a family member. And even that friend hadn't seen him for about 2.5 years. So we had some significant issues in trying to build up a better profile on the victim's lifestyle.
Police hoped they could find some forensic evidence at the scene that might shed more light on William and his killer.
Literally, to begin with, we had John's lifeless body on the top floor and not an awful lot to go on in the initial stages.
It took us a few days after the officers had obviously been at the scene doing the forensic work that we managed to lift a finger mark on the sash window at the front of the premises. But that didn't necessarily take us forward at that stage, because I remember saying to my staff, well, that finger mark may very well be from the victim. He could have easily been locked out of his address and tried to get in through the window recently. We knew that the finger mark itself was fairly recent, days old, not weeks old, which was good for us. But we knew until we actually were able to eliminate the victim, then the question would be, if it's not his, then who else is it?
A logical theory at the time was that William might have interrupted a burglary in progress before he was beaten to death. But searching the property further, police had made a surprising discovery.
Inside the house, it really was a building site. William was living on the upper floor, but importantly and interestingly, in the house, we very quickly found large sums of cash. There'd be £1,000 here, £1,000 there.
He would just put them in shopping bags and just throw them into a corner in his living room or his dining room. And that's something that neither myself or my team had ever come across. You can sometimes go to someone's address and you can find money in a drawer, in a wallet, or in a jacket pocket. But you don't tend to find thousands and thousands of pounds just lying around in bin liners or shopping bags.
Howard and the team concluded this must be collected rent money from William's properties. Before moving into his current address, William had been living in Fulham. A search of that address also revealed tens of thousands of pounds just lying around.
So that was very unusual. But that also brought with it certain issues that the team had to deal with, because from the moment that they informed me that they had found that significant amount of cash at both addresses, they had to stop what they were doing.
I've never seen anything like it. In total, we found over £350,000 in cash just lying around in uncounted bundles, an astonishing amount of money.
We had to therefore then get officers from a particular unit that would come and witness them counting the money and then securing it so that it can then be taken away. Because obviously one of the things we had to ensure is that the credibility of those officers was maintained, and for the organisation that there couldn't be any suggestion at a later stage that more money was there and we only retrieved X when there was Y. So that was an unusual thing. We'd never experienced doing anything of that magnitude before.
At the Brook Green house, officers eventually counted nearly £250,000 in cash, and there was even more at other addresses.
I'm wondering whether this almost obsessive collection of money, hiding it, not putting it in a bank, but putting it in various different properties, was a form of him feeling secure, having some control over his life. And what does money often give you? A feeling of, I've got everything I need around me. I've got security. No one can take it away from me. And therefore it gives me some sense of control over what happens to me.
With so much money still in his home, it was not immediately obvious what motive William's killer may have had.
Some may argue and say that this case has the hallmarks of a robbery that's gone wrong. I don't think that this is the case. Usually in cases whereby robberies have gone wrong, the assault, the violence tends to be quite moderate. In this case, there's evidence to suggest that the violence that was inflicted on William was quite extreme, it was aggressive, and it has the descriptions of overkill. And as such, I don't think that this case is a robbery that had gone wrong.
When William's autopsy results came back, they revealed he had died from head injuries caused by up to 9 blows with a blunt instrument.
William's death was a mystery for several weeks after the crime. Why would anybody seek to kill, especially in such a brutal manner, a 58-year-old man who, by all accounts, was completely harmless and kept himself to himself. There was no murder weapon found, and there was seemingly absolutely no reason for his ultimately savage death.
In search of a motive, the police started to look towards William's complex business dealings for suspects.
William's business model was to take up properties like this that needed renovating. He'd turn them into a number of different apartments, flats or rooms, and he would put a phone number on these rooms. He'd rent them out, he'd collect the rent, he'd collect the deposits, but then he'd get rid of his mobile phone. That property alone, we had 67 mobile phone numbers and phones that were attributable to him.
William's mysterious lifestyle was not helping to catch his killer.
If you find out how somebody lives, you stand a better chance of understanding why it is that they may have died.
The police investigation was soon to take a very different direction, as it headed far from William's home. In October 2011, the Met Police's Homicide and Major Crime Division were investigating the murder of reclusive property multimillionaire William Saunderson Smith, who had been found battered to death in the bedroom of his London townhouse.
For the first couple of weeks, we didn't have a suspect, there was nobody arrested. We were doing our investigation, there was an awful lot of material to be going through. There was a lot going on.
The police investigating William's death were baffled by the case and were struggling to either track down his next of kin or to paint a picture of his life.
We had to really try and reverse engineer his life to try and find out really what had happened. We understood from one friend that we could find that he was gay, yet we didn't really have any other understanding of exactly what his private life looked like. So to begin with, we had a number of different strands that we needed to look at to try and find if there was some sort of motive.
Even keeping track of William's phone contacts was a struggle.
I've never had a murder investigation where you've got 67 phones attributable to one victim. There was no phone that was particularly identifiable to be his current phone. All these phones just scattered around the 4 floors of his townhouse.
With bundles of money totalling nearly £250,000 left in William's house, robbery seemed an unlikely motive. In an effort to track William's last known movements, the police launched a media appeal.
There were plenty of gay venues in and around Old Brompton Road in Kensington, which he would often frequent, and that was another line of police inquiry in terms of, was this a sexually motivated crime?
We didn't discover too much about his lifestyle, his private life. We knew he was gay, but didn't really know anything more than that.
It seemed likely that William knew his killer, but with few family and friends to talk to, there were no obvious suspects.
Just because somebody is difficult, a recluse, has a secret existence, and might be not the world's greatest landlord and may at times have underpaid people, does not mean they deserve to be bludgeoned to death.
William had a number of enemies, upset a lot of people in his day-to-day dealings, whether it was his tenants that he hadn't given their money back, whether it was builders that he had disputes with or hadn't paid.
Through his business dealings, police found William had built up a list of people with a grudge against him.
There were a lot of people that we came across that, not necessarily a reason to kill him, but certainly a reason to dislike him. People who really didn't have any warm words to say about John, and that's a bit sad. And that made our investigation a little trickier.
Finally, the police got a break. They managed to get hold of footage from a nearby hotel security camera that showed the comings and goings in and out of Williams Road.
It's a one-way street, and down at the very end of the street there, before it hits the main road, on the left-hand side there's a property there, and that had CCTV, and that turned out to be pivotal in our investigation. So on the CCTV, we saw 3 people. It was quite a mild evening, but in the early hours of the morning, we saw 3 people that were dressed almost for winter, with their jackets done up and their collars done up, and the caps and hoodies up, hanging around, and that was quite unusual. Also on that CCTV, we saw one car in particular that seemed to just go round and round and round the area about a dozen times in the hours leading up to the murder. And this was a gold-coloured Land Rover Freelander and had a big dent in the side, so it was hugely identifiable for our purposes.
It was good enough to tell us that at a certain time during that evening that a vehicle had driven into the road from the opposite direction. At least 2 to 3 people had alighted the vehicle. 1 person remained in the vehicle, and we surmised that that person was probably acting as a lookout, and that at least 2 other people then went in the direction of the victim's address.
The footage was too grainy to identify faces or the car's number plate, but the police now knew they were potentially looking for not just a killer, but killers. And the painstaking analysis of William's hoard of cell phones brought another breakthrough.
There was an awful lot of material to be going through. There were 67 mobile phones, and when we're going through those phones, we don't really find much on any of these phones. There's the phone calls, of course, but nothing else that's significant that leads us in any particular direction until we get to the very last phone, the 67th phone. And there's one text message on that phone that shows a little bit of emotion. It says, "How are you doing? ? Many kisses."
This was just a text in isolation, 2 months old, and we thought, is there a relationship between the victim and the person whose this text message has been sent to? So the alarm bells came up for us in terms of thinking, does this have some significance, some relevance to the investigation? It wasn't difficult for us to then establish who that particular phone number belonged to.
William had sent the text to a Polish man called David Reimar, someone who also knew William as John.
David Reimar was already a name that was in our system as a builder that had done some work for John in the weeks leading up to his murder. And so straight away, we thought, well, let's have a little bit more of a look at David Reimar. Could David Reimar be gay? Could he be a boyfriend of John's? We don't know. So we started looking at David Reimar, and that's really when the investigation took a significant turn.
We were able to establish where he lived. Officers visited that address. They weren't able to find him, but what they were able to establish is that Reimar hadn't been seen at that address for at least 2 days. His girlfriend hadn't seen him, neither had the landlord, and that was out of character. You'd normally see him at the address. His girlfriend would have spoken to him. So yet again, the lights are flashing for us in terms of why is this individual disappeared all of a sudden?
David Reimar lived in Acton, not far from Brook Green. But as they had his number, the team could access and examine location data to see where and when his phone was used.
His phone was in the Hammersmith area at the time of the murder. So what we then said was that he's one of those 3 individuals outside in the early hours of the morning when we think William was killed. And when we looked at his phone, he'd made phone calls as well, also in that area at the time. And he had made 2 phone calls in particular to Milosz and also to Mugiewski. Mugiewski worked at a bus garage locally, and that's where he knew Mr. Milosz from as well. So it was these 3 guys that became our prime suspects.
The suspects were Polish. They were builders by profession, and we believe that the victim had obviously used them because it was cash in hand. But we don't believe that the relationship with them was anything more than casual labor. They weren't someone that he had been using for years and years and years and had built up a significant rapport with. They were just people that he had called upon on occasions to do particular work for him.
The builders would have known about him because they would have been in close proximity within a professional capacity. They worked for William on an ad hoc basis. As such, they had access to his properties and may have seen large amounts of sums in William's possession. Homicides in the UK tend to be a characteristic of a close proximity between victim and offender.
When we let new people into our lives, we look for reassurances they can be trusted from family or friends. William, however, had few people in his life, so when he opened his door, he was letting in strangers.
William had a reclusive, secret lifestyle. His sexuality, his financial status, not perhaps putting money in a bank, but more hiding it in some of his properties. And I think this then builds an image of quite a mysterious character. Now, if you think about it from the point of view of outsiders coming in, they may have a sense of secrecy. They may have a sense of, you know, this guy's underpaying us, but he seems to have a lot of money. What's going on with him? And this may give it a different potency in their eyes. How much money has this guy got, and can we get something out of him?
Winding back the hotel's CCTV footage to earlier on in the day of William's murder, the police could see 3 men arriving at the house, presumably to do some work for him.
They did a recce of the address before. You know, we were confident that they had driven around and had identified where CCTV footage was likely to be. They took all the back routes that they could to get to the address in the first instance, and we were able to prove that. They didn't go on the high roads. They basically doubled back from using the side streets, getting to the address, reversing the car around and heading back through the side streets. We were able to show that the 3 phones for those 3 individuals were all in a particular area at a particular time together. So they weren't at 3 different locations across London at the time the victim was attacked. They were all pinging close to the victim's address.
The CCTV also showed William leaving his house.
We found footage that showed the victim leaving his address and visiting a timber yard to get some items from there. And when he came back, we knew that the people who were working at his address on a particular day had left, because the footage could show people leaving. So we wondered whether he had been deliberately asked to go away from the address to allow them to take away the money.
Whatever the men took, they obviously decided it wasn't enough.
On reflection, once they had left the address, they probably said to themselves, well, hang on, if we found that money, there's probably more, and hence the reason why they decided to come back. So it was greed.
They returned later that night by car, waiting for William to go to bed.
We noticed a Land Rover Freelander car, and this gold-coloured Freelander had a big dent in the side. Went past the property about a dozen times at the time of the murder, just before. And we managed to link that car to Mr. Bugievsky. He owned the car. So what we're saying is that Mr. Bugievsky took the other 2 to the murder scene. All 3 went in. They all came out, and then they made good their escape in Mr. Bugievsky's Freelander.
We were able to map where that vehicle went afterwards, and as a result of that, identify addresses where at least 2 other suspects resided at.
Using mobile phone data, the detectives continued to track the movements of the suspects immediately after the time William was killed.
Importantly, David Reimar left the country from Victoria Coach Station within hours of the murder. He had taken the first coach from Victoria Coach Station to Paris.
Bugievsky followed suit, leaving on a later coach to Paris to join up with Reimar.
There were photographs taken of them at the Eiffel Tower. We knew that some of the purchases that they'd made was more than likely would have been done by the money that they had recovered from the address.
The evidence police were gathering was pointing at William's builders, but finding them was going to be a whole new challenge.
It's all good having all that information and that evidence, but it was about apprehending those individuals now, because we still had 3 suspects at large. We had 3 prime suspects that weren't in this country. And then the question for me as the SIO was, how do we get them back?
In November 2011, police had identified the 3 men they believed had brutally murdered reclusive 58-year-old William John Saunderson Smith in his London home. Records showed that all 3 had now returned to their native Poland.
Normally, you'd be thinking about getting a warrant for them to come back, but that is a quite protracted and time-consuming process. And you know that the longer it takes you to get letters of request and for you to get the authority to get the warrant for them and then that to be executed, they could have easily well have moved on again from Poland and gone to another country.
It was 4 weeks since William had been murdered when Howard and the team discovered two of the suspects, Bugiewski and Midlars, had returned to the UK.
Having escaped to Poland and then thinking that the coast was seemingly clear, they returned to the UK, but little did they know police were already on their trail.
I think most certainly Mr. Bugiewski and Mr. Mulas, they had no idea that we were onto them. And I think they felt it was safe to come back to the UK. And they came back and they were wrong.
Police arrested the pair in their homes on November 18th, 2011. 38-year-old Slavomir Bugiewski was charged with murder. A week later, on November 26th, Ireneusz Midlars was charged with the same. Bugiewski's car was also seized.
We did some forensic work on it, and we were able to recover at least 2 bloodstain marks within the vehicle of the victim. So that in itself was significant evidence, because we were then going to be able to say, why is the victim's blood in this vehicle? There's no reason why he should have been in it. Not only that, but there was a mixed profile within the victim's blood of one of the suspects, which would have indicated that at the time of the attack, one of the suspects must have attacked the victim.
There were now 3 prime suspects for William's murder, but what had happened that day in the house was still a mystery. One of the 3 builders, 24-year-old David Reimar, was still at large in Poland.
We thought, why not just give him a ring? We gave him a ring. We knew he was quite an overconfident, arrogant chap. And we said to David, look, we're investigating this murder. We know you know him. Can you come back, please? We want to have a talk to you about it. And he said, yeah, OK, I'll come back to the UK. I couldn't believe that he'd agreed to it. And I thought, well, maybe he's just going to go on the run now in Poland. But we bought him a plane ticket, and he got on that plane. And then when he came back to the UK, he was arrested off the plane.
William hadn't let many people into his life, let alone his home. But when he did, it seemed they had betrayed his trust in the worst possible way.
There's a notion in criminology known as the ideal victim, and the ideal victim is often vulnerable. And some of the vulnerabilities that William had in this case was wealth.
The police wanted to make sure the murder charges stuck. When they questioned David on his return to the UK, he gave nothing away.
He said, yes, I knew John. I'd done some work for him in the past as a builder. He didn't pay particularly well. But then I just chose to go back to Poland. I'd finished a relationship with my girlfriend and I just wanted to go back to Poland. We asked him why he'd gone via France, and he didn't really have an answer for that other than it was the first opportunity to get out of the country.
In terms of the text message, we were never able to establish whether there was a relationship between Reimar and our victim. But to be perfectly honest with you, that was not something that was going to concern us anymore. The mere fact that we were able to identify who that phone number was attributed to was enough. We didn't have to drill down into that anymore.
One thing that became hugely apparent to us was that David had money problems. And Mr. Bugiewski, he owed people money as well. This, for us, we're saying, was a motive for the killing.
The CPS, on reflection, having looked at all of the mounting of evidence that we'd gathered in terms of forensics, in terms of phone data, in terms of CCTV footage, the CPS decided, yes, sufficient for them to be charged. And then, as they say, let the battle commence.
On Monday, 16th of July 2012, Reimar, Bugiewski and Midlars all went on trial for murder at the Old Bailey. All three pleaded not guilty.
The victim received at least 9 blows to the head and what we would have described as a blunt instrument. So it was a vicious attack.
The aim was to kill. It's as simple as that. Any trauma to the head can be fatal, regardless of force. The killers would have known this. He was brutally beaten to death.
This was one of the most shocking murder cases that I covered in my 4 years in Hammersmith and Fulham. Police were flummoxed at first, and it was such a violent crime and such a senseless crime.
I think this was a question in terms of why would they decide to attack him like that. It could have well have been frustration. He wasn't prepared to tell them where the money was. They were probably convinced that there was more money there. They had taken time and effort to go back to the address, probably thinking that they were going to find more money. And in the heat of the moment, they probably were frustrated and just decided to attack him.
Forensic evidence showed to the court revealed David Reimar's finger mark was on the broken window at William's house, and the blood found in Bugievski's car was David and William's mixed together.
So when Mr. Bugievski came back to the country voluntarily, he had said he had taken a taxi to Victoria Coach Station. And interestingly, the taxi driver that we spoke to remembers that Mr. Bugievski had a roll of what he thought was about £1,000, and that he had no idea of how much to pay the taxi driver. And these were important facts for us that we were able to present to a jury.
In their defence, each of the accused tried their best to explain the evidence.
Reimar was asked why is it that his blood was found in a mixed profile with that of the victim. And his defense was that he was attacked by the victim on the night in question, and he was defending himself. I think the jury discounted that very quickly and said, well, you know, it's at least 2 of you attacking him and there's 9 blows to the head. There can be no justification for that. They shouldn't have been in the property in the first place.
Interestingly, I remember, though, that when we were going through how much money was at the house, and there was a big bundle, a black bin liner full of cash, just by William's head. And when we told the court how much money was in that, there were tens of thousands of pounds in there. You could see all 3 suspects sort of rolling their eyes if, say, we've missed that. There was no doubt in my mind that they were guilty. But at that particular point, I knew beyond all doubt those guys had done it, and the jury agreed.
On August 10th, 2012, after a 4-week trial, all 3 men were convicted of the murder of William Sanderson Smith and jailed for life to serve a minimum of 30 years.
There was a definite sense of justice being done in the courtroom. The detail of what they put William through really was truly horrific, and they deserve every single day of their sentences. It was also a relief for the community, knowing that the 3 suspects were no longer at large.
The only family of Williams that the police had been able to find was the cousin he'd grown up with.
He would normally visit them at Christmas. He would always bring presents. He was quiet, but he was a loving individual.
William's story is incredibly tragic and painful because you've got somebody who is a recluse. Perhaps he may have issues around allowing people to get too close to him, so compartmentalised his life in quite a complex, complicated way. And what a terrible, tragic end to his own life.
I think his family, as any family, would struggle to come to terms with William's death, the brutality of it, the senselessness of it, and I'm sure to this day they still miss him.
William had tragedy in his life from a very early age, and sadly, it ended that way too. meeting someone, falling in love, having a baby. These are some of life's greatest moments, or they should be. But in 2013, one young mother's life reached an horrific premature end.
Everything was going well for her. She was beautiful and had been a contestant in Miss Africa. She'd been a model. In 2009, she met the man who went on to kill her.
Linah Keza lived here amongst one of these flats we see here, and it was here where she met her death. She lived in fear for the last days of her life.
Sometimes hopes and dreams shatter, and the very people you trust and feel safest with can become a danger to you.
There are lovely parts of Leighton with plenty of beautiful housing, affordable to most people, and with easy access to the city and to London. It's a nice place to live.
In 2012, the London suburb of Leighton was home to 29-year-old Linah Keza. Linah was very close to her older brother, Ivan.
She used to enjoy life as a normal person. She grew up in a Christian family, but as she was growing up, she got her education.
The family's roots were in Africa.
Linah came from a very educated and, I would say, elite family in Rwanda. She was someone who seems like she was a very vibrant and loving person, and certainly her family absolutely adored her.
We grew up in a Christian family. My dad was a reverend of a church. My dad did everything to make sure that he educated not only boys, but also girls as well.
In 1998, Ivan left war-torn Rwanda to try and build a new life in the UK. Almost 10 years later, in 2007, Linah followed in his footsteps.
When she came here first time, she stayed with me, but then she moved over to Wolverhampton because that's where she applied for higher education.
For Linah, moving from Rwanda to the UK would have been a huge move in all sorts of ways, culturally, lifestyle, but she took the big step and came here.
Amazingly, Linah, when she came over here, she settled in easily. Her character is like, she takes things so easy.
While in London, Linah had a big impact on everyone she met, and soon became involved in modelling.
She met up a guy somewhere here in London where he used to be a photographer, and from there, he just decided to take her on. And just from then, she was into modeling. That's how I remember the first time she told me, I said, what? She was doing that and doing whatever she wanted to do. Yeah, and it was working for her.
Linah was beautiful, kind, charming, and highly intelligent. She was studying for a bachelor's degree at the University of Wolverhampton. The future seemed bright.
She wanted to be a social worker. We have evidence of her trying to get into the university to do a programme to help her qualify here.
She knew that one day when she goes to Rwanda, she's going to change how they do their social working in Rwanda.
It wasn't all work for Linah. She also continued with another of her loves, dance.
She had so many friends, people around her. She was a good dancer, every type of dance, but normally she wanted to dance our traditional dance because even when she came over here, she created her own group.
It was through her love of dance that in 2009, Linah met a man, David Gikawa.
Linah was from a Rwandan background. Gikawa was from a Ugandan background, but they met at a Rwandan dance night. And outwardly charming, they fell in love.
The first time I was scared as a big brother. And then I said, I want to know the person. I want to see the guy. And then when I saw him, then, okay. You know, like the normal person, she's grown up, she makes her own decisions. So I just respected the way she handled the whole thing.
In 2010, Linah added another string to her bow when she became a contestant in the annual Miss Africa competition.
I remember when she wanted to join Miss Africa. It was a joke, but for some reasons, she just go with it.
It was during the competition that she got some surprising news that changed her relationship with David.
She became pregnant in around 2010. I think things started to go wrong. She was dependent on him financially. I also think that she probably felt quite ashamed about being pregnant, and she also probably really wanted things to work out.
Linah kept her pregnancy quiet for as long as she could. She graduated university, and she and David decided to leave Wolverhampton.
She moved to London, which meant that she was kind of isolated from her family, even though her family were very loving and supportive of her.
I didn't even realize that she was pregnant. But then, because it was the first pregnancy, so I thought she just put on weight. One day I confronted her, and then she told me that she was pregnant. And by then, I think she was 8 months pregnant. Then she told me not to tell my mom. Of course, I said I can never hide it away from my mom, so I had to ring my mom. When I spoke to mom about it, my mom took it easy. Said, that's fine. The baby's gonna come, we're gonna look after the baby. That was it.
At the start, Linah and David had a good relationship, but it went downhill when she became pregnant and they relocated to London.
That's when it also started to get violent. So he was financially abusive, but he was emotionally abusive and verbally abusive. He was also physically abusive.
When the violence happened the first time, I told her I'm going to confront him. But she tried to calm it down. I said, no, you leave it, I'll deal with it. I have to confront him. No, she just asked me to calm down, to wait and see. But again, it didn't stop. It kept on going throughout her pregnancy until she had a baby as well. Still the same. To the extreme that she came, she was scared even to call anybody in front of her.
Domestic abuse is all about power and control, and it's one person believing they have the right to control another person. We all identify, or most people identify, domestic abuse as physical violence, broken bones, black eyes, but actually domestic abuse can be many other forms. It could be being controlled financially or sexually, psychologically, technologically, a really wide range.
In September 2010, David and Linah's baby was born. But the abuse at home continued to get worse.
She told me that she was having a problem one day because, normally she said, is there a way, she came one day, she asked me, is there a way you can go and tell him off never to touch me again? But in the beginning I thought, what happened? She didn't want to give me the whole details until her friends started telling me.
It's sad to say, but a lot of individuals tend to tolerate abuse from their partners for multiple reasons. One of the main ones being fear. They're scared of the actions and the consequences of leaving their partner.
I managed to go to the guy. I even told him, really, what you're doing is wrong for a woman. And he denied everything. Again, they stayed together for that moment.
From what we understand about her relationship, from the get-go, this was an on-again, off-again relationship, which was described as very turbulent, and it was not unusual for the police to be called.
He was hitting her, putting the pillow in her face, covering her, to suffocate her. Not once, he's done it many times. I was worried. I rang her when she was that time telling me what happened. I said, you know what, that man is going to kill you.
Parents will always try and do what they think is best for their child. Linah's family and friends were beginning to fear for her safety.
So we know of 2 incidences, one in 2011 where he attempted to strangle her, which is a big red flag in domestic abuse situations.
There was a watershed moment where Giko had tried to strangle her, and this clearly was that this couldn't go on. He was not going to be reformed. Whatever the issues, she had to get herself and her daughter out of this clutches of this man.
In March 2011, 36-year-old security guard David Gikawa attacked his partner Linah. She called the police, but he was released without charge.
Gikawa was a prolific violence offender. It was known to authorities that he was violent, yet for some reason the police did not take this case seriously. And this tends to be the case in domestic violence settings.
Every day, police attend domestic violence calls, and very often nothing is done. The victim doesn't want to go ahead with it. But we need to understand domestic violence more than ever. In this particular case, he was controlling. She called the police for help.
In a domestic violence cycle, tension builds. The person then explodes. Then they feel remorseful. And it's in this remorseful period where the victim may think, all right, they're being nice to me. And then you go through this whole cycle again, the tension building, the rage, the explosion.
Over the next month, the violence escalated and the police were called again.
There was also an incident where he assaulted her and held a knife in her mouth and threatened to kill her. Now, both of those incidents, the police were called, but neither of them resulted in a prosecution.
From the outside looking in, people may think, why don't you just get away from this person? Why? Because he's so awful to you. But from the victim's point of view, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. There's fear at the heart of this. What is going to happen next? Imagine living like that, not day to day, but moment to moment. That can destroy a person.
In 2012, Linah took their baby and moved out of the flat she and David shared.
Linah quickly realised she had to get out. He was violent towards her. He told her that if he couldn't have her, no one would. He wouldn't allow anyone to have her.
He managed to control her. The way he even came in, banging the doors, entering, but she just tried to calm it down.
With domestic violence, very often the victim doesn't want to pursue an inquiry, doesn't want to pursue the investigation because they are being controlled and they don't want to go ahead with the investigation. And they also believe that next time it won't happen. He will change his ways.
Linah had finally had enough, but would David accept that it was over between them? Linah moved to a new flat in Walthamstow, but David soon followed her there.
When I was there trying to do a bit of renovation, painting the house, and he came over there, he didn't even want to go. Because of Linah's character, he just let him stay and then ask him to help her, and he stayed.
Acting like nothing had changed, David had persuaded Linah that they were still a couple. However, the violence now started to spread outside the house.
They were in a club somewhere here called Kent Road. For some reasons, David got angry, agitated, and grabbed her neck and threw her in the car and drove back home. But her friends called the police and sent them there. The police came, they found Linah was on the floor, David on top of her with a knife. And actually, he punched through the carpet and she was moving ahead. The police came in. When they came in, they took him. All they've done is just arrest him for one night.
Even though she'd involved the authorities, it seemed as if Linah's pleas were falling on deaf ears. Meanwhile, David's behaviour was getting more and more frightening.
Linah reached out to the police. She spoke to them and she told them that Gikawa was being abusive towards her, Gikawa was stalking her, Gikawa threatened her.
He didn't want anyone else to have her. He wanted to control her, and because he couldn't have her, he had a violent background and clearly a drink problem. He had all the classic symptoms. All the alarm bells were ringing.
They stayed together, I think, because Linah wanted to do what was best, what she thought was best for their daughter, to try and establish a stable family background.
She was one of the best mother. She loved her baby so much. It was like it was her life.
She was very loving of her family and in particular her daughter. And I think all of her, she was motivated by wanting to have a good, supportive life full of opportunity for her daughter.
At the end of 2012, Linah needed a break. She took her daughter and flew to Africa to visit her sister. Here she finally revealed the truth about David.
She'd gone back to see her family. She told her sister that he was threatening. He threatened to kill her.
She spent a very important, special time with her sister. In that time, she did share with them that the relationship with Gikawa was falling apart, and that she was planning on leaving him. And they were supportive to her in doing that.
It was so painful. I remember my sister back home in Rwanda, she was crying, telling David, why can't you just leave her? Why can't you just leave her? Because it was too much.
On average, it takes a woman around 7 attempts to leave an abusive partner before finally leaving. Leaving is a process. It's very complex. It's not easy to make a decision to change your life.
When she came back, she asked him if he can leave. That's why, that's it. He didn't want to leave.
Linah was determined. It became clear she would have to be the one to make the break.
In around May 2013, she decided that she was going to leave him, and she did everything she possibly could. She asked him to leave the house. She tried to get her keys off him, but he kept on coming back. She'd wake up and he'd be there staring at her. He became more and more erratic.
He was started stalking her. Like, actually, full time he stalked her all the way.
She finally packed her things and moved to Leighton.
In 2013, she told him, that's it, it's over. 4 years is enough, we're walking away. And that sparked the inner rage within Kawa himself that he was not going to allow this to happen.
After years of abuse at the hands of her boyfriend David Gikawa, Linah Keza had moved into a new flat with her daughter.
Linah had only moved to this flat when she ended her relationship with Gikawa to get away from him to a place where she thought she and her 2-year-old daughter would be safe.
Linah would have felt very afraid. She was desperate and did as much as she could to protect herself and her daughter from harm.
I think it would have been incredibly difficult for Linah to leave this guy because she also had a child with him. Now, people in this kind of domestic violence web, what's going on for the abuser is that they feel they have the right to totally control somebody else's existence.
In July 2013, she started to get very worried because essentially he was stalking her. He'd appear at her house, she'd see him regularly outside the window, and she started to do everything that she could to protect herself.
It was becoming so controlling, so much of tormenting. I don't know how I can describe those last weeks.
She sought help. She saw a solicitor. She wanted him to be arrested for stalking, harassing her. She was trying to get an injunction. She wanted to take action.
So she went to a solicitor to try and get an injunction or a non-molestation order against him. And there is a statement that she wrote that she gave to the solicitors. That injunction was never, in fact, filed.
By late July, things were reaching a head.
On the 23rd, he came, he had a knife there. He said, look, I'll kill anyone who's gonna come next to you. She managed to text her friend in Uganda to ring the police here in the UK, but just texting. Can you just call the police?
999, which service do you require?
The police turned up, but they assessed the situation as standard risk, which is the lowest level of risk. She called them again the following day. Now, when a domestic violence incident happens, the police are supposed to look back on the history of whether there's been previous domestic violence incidences.
There was strict protocols in place which the police had instituted some years earlier to deal with these sort of domestic incidents, stroke honour killings, stroke stalking. And that involved a 5-year intelligence check on the suspect. They didn't do it.
If you see from the 23rd, you could see she knew someone was going to kill her.
All the alarm bells were ringing, nobody was listening. More should have been done to protect Linah.
On the evening of 28th of July 2013, David Gikawa was continuing to stalk Linah and was outside her flat.
She phoned the police 3 times, telling them, this man's got a knife, he's already slashed one of my friend's car's tyres, he's outside. I'm so scared, I can't breathe. Eventually at 1 a.m, 2 police constables turned up. She showed them evidence of the fear that she was living in, the slashed tyres. She taped Gikawa, threatening her, albeit in Ugandan, but the tone of her voice would have been unmistakable.
Which is obviously an incredibly intimidating and dangerous thing to do. They didn't take the details of the friends who were witnesses in terms of the harassment that she was suffering. They didn't take the details of the children who were at the house, and they assessed the case as medium risk.
She told them, you've got to save me from this man.
With the assessed risk increasing, the police filed another report and requested David contact them if he wanted to visit his daughter or attend Linah's flat for any reason. Ivan, by now very concerned, spoke to his sister.
She was still worried. She was so worried about him. And she was saying to me, he sent a coffin, a candle, a cross, and a bow to her on the mobile phone. So I said, did he send you that? I said, yeah. So the man is going.
One of the vulnerabilities for sure that Linah would have had was isolation. She would have found it extremely difficult to confide in someone, a friend, a family member. So the fact that she approached the police just goes to show how desperate she was and how isolated she would have felt because of what she was going through.
She told me that it's like I'm in a prison in my own home. I said, okay, do you know what? Why can't you come over, stay here for a while? She told me, don't worry, I told people that I'm going on holiday. So she was planning to go to see, to visit her other friends.
Gikawa was trying to get in contact with Linah. She was refusing to speak to him. He was knocking on her door. He was trying to communicate with her, whether it was by phone or face-to-face. And as such, Gikawa clearly snapped. He wanted to control Linah, but she wasn't giving him the opportunity to do so.
Frustrated by the lack of contact, David Gikawa asked the police for permission to collect his belongings from Linah's home.
He had to apply to the police first to make sure he didn't misbehave. So he phoned the police and said, I want to pick up my personal items. The call was taken. The police sergeant, who should have, again, followed the protocol set down on how to deal with these matters, and that is to carry out a 2-year previous check on Gikawa's record. He didn't. He said they had no officers available to go with him, so he said, well, why don't you go along? I'm sure it'll be fine. and he closed the file. And that, as the family believe, and I think very reasonably believe, was a fatal decision.
There were 26 hits on David Gikawa, that he carried a knife, that he was dangerous.
He didn't want anyone else to have her. The days leading up was systematic. He was in control. He didn't want anyone to have her. He was determined to kill her.
At about 4 a.m. on the 31st of July 2013, Gikawa let himself into Linah's flat in Leighton.
And on that fateful night, he had a key, let himself in.
He grabbed Linah by the throat. She let out screams of terror, which her neighbour overheard, and instead of going back to sleep and ignoring it, he immediately ran to Linah's front door, banged on, banged and banged on. He could hear her shouting, "Kick the door in, kick the door in." But he couldn't get in because Gecko had his back to the door so that he couldn't force his way past.
Gikawa stabbed Linah once. She was clearly suffering. He knew that he had full control of her, yet he still stabbed her again. And this just goes to show and reiterate and reinforce Gikawa's violent nature. He was in full control, which is something that he wants always with Linah, yet he was not willing to let go.
Gikawa had his hand round Linah's neck and then stabbed her brutally, and the neighbour managed to get in, forced his way in, and Gikawa, like a coward, ran away.
What he saw was the most horrendous sight of this poor girl lying in a pool of blood.
She died of her multiple stab wounds. And that neighbour, traumatised and just couldn't get there. And he's got to live with that for the rest of his life, poor man, that he tried everything and heard those screams. But it was all too late.
On the 31st of July, Linah's brother Ivan received a number of calls.
When I woke up, I had some few phone calls. I ignored them because I was getting ready. I don't want to be late to go to work.
I saw this text message. Oh, someone just said, "I'm so sorry about your sister. She's been stabbed." I said, "What?" And I rang that number, and then they told me. I couldn't believe it. Actually, in my head, straight away, if it wasn't David, there was nobody. I jumped on a train going to Leighton. The train was so slow, I was like, I can't believe this. And then I'm trying to ring home. They don't know what I'm talking about. I'm trying to ring some friends. I say, "Can you confirm?" You know, all these things, not even me, no one even could understand. And then, until about 8 o'clock when everything just blew out from the media, the news.
David had fled to avoid facing the consequences of his horrific actions. The police launched a manhunt.
He intended to kill her. This wasn't a case of manslaughter, and it wasn't a whodunit. All the elements were there to prove murder in this particular case. However, there were also all the elements to prevent her from dying. There should have been early intervention.
In Leighton, East London, former model Linah Keza had been stabbed to death by her ex-partner David Gikawa while her 2-year-old daughter was in the flat.
These are the flats where Linah Keza lived and where she was brutally murdered. She lived the last days of her life here in her own home in a state of fear.
On July 31st, having received news about the attack, Linah's brother Ivan arrived in Leighton.
The place was cordoned off with the police. I said, "I've got my sister living here." And one of the officers asked me, "Which is your sister?" I said, "Linah. Is she fine?" Because I thought she maybe just a stabbing, she'll be fine. The next thing, one of the liaison officers came to me. For the first time, I thought she's in the hospital maybe. So I wanted to know which hospital she's in. Until one of the officers came to me and said she was killed. I thought if this is a dream, please let me wake up. I don't want to. It was so painful. I was one of the worst dreams.
After hearing the news of her violent death, Linah's devastated friends and family struggled to comprehend what had happened.
The only thing I asked, did he break in the house? They said no. The door was open. So I don't know if he managed to manipulate her to open the door or what he did. I just realized, okay, my sister's gone.
Gikawa had fled the scene. The police needed to find him fast.
When you launch a manhunt, particularly when you know this guy is guilty of murder, we know that he's murdered Linah, so immediately you do media, release his photograph to the media. We know who's done it, there's no question of that. There's a witness, there's forensic evidence.
Of course, the police asked, because the first thing I said, I know it's him. They said, who? And I said, David. So do you know him? I said, I know him. Of course, they called me on the side. I said, there's no one else. I said, just look for him.
And then you do an all ports warning, let the airports, let ports know, let all police organisations across the country know.
He was trying his friends to give him a passport so he can just go. But some of his friends, some other guy said, you're not gonna go. The other guy just realized what he done. And he just said, look, you're not going nowhere. So he just refused to give him the passport.
As the hours went on and the alarm had been raised, and he realised that his own home would be the first place the police would go to, he realised he had no place to go. And so later that day, he gave himself up at the nearest police station.
David had given himself up and was now safely in custody. But if police thought this might lead to him doing the right thing and admitting his guilt, they were sadly mistaken.
So after he killed her, he fled the scene, he was chased, the police arrested him, he was arrested for murder, and there was a trial.
Linah's death had resulted from years of abuse at the hands of her partner. But despite this, Gikawa was still pleading his innocence.
The very tragic case of Linah being murdered was deeply shocking and upsetting. We read about the case in the press and we made an approach to her family, to her brother Ivan, and developed a relationship at that point to offer support to the family.
Due to his not guilty plea, David Gikawa went on trial at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of April 2014, charged with Linah's murder.
As soon as I arrived at court and could find out before the trial started what the issues were, it became very clear that this wasn't an old-fashioned murder in the sense of who done it. It was much more, why was it allowed to happen? And that the jealous boyfriend was obviously going to be found guilty.
The family were made to endure the trial. One of the things that caused the family a lot of pain was that he sort of talked badly of her, despite everything that he had done.
Trial. It was another trauma because it took a while as well. It took us nearly a month. Yeah, it was so sad the way he tried to slag off Linah. The way he tried to disrespect her. He didn't even give her a chance to rest in peace.
During the trial, a picture emerged of David Gikawa as a very violent man.
The trial was all about David Gikawa and his violent background and his violent tendencies, and the evidence, obviously, of the murder, of how he had done it and why he had done it.
His background was scary, and I don't even know how he managed to get away with the whole thing. Because if you see his origin from Uganda, the crimes he's done, even the girlfriends he had, the way he was brutally beating them up, I was like, wow. I didn't even know. All that just came out.
As far as I could see, Gikawa showed no remorse at all. It was clear that he thought that he had acted reasonably.
He said he was planning to kill her, kill the daughter, and kill himself. They asked him, so why didn't he do it? He says, because the knife broke. into Linah, so he couldn't do the rest of it. Lie after lie after lie. He lied about everything. He lied his origin. He lied about everything.
Finally, on the 23rd of May 2014, the jury reached a verdict.
The jury's verdict would have come as no surprise to anyone, really, because of the mountain of evidence that the prosecution was able to produce in court to show that he was clearly the killer.
In this particular case, Gikawa was what we call bang to rights. He was at the scene, he was seen by a witness, there was intention, there was motive, Linah was his partner, so all the elements to prove this case was there, and obviously an abundance of forensic evidence.
David Gikawa was convicted unanimously by the jury of murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending that he serve a minimum of 21 years before he could even apply for release to the parole board.
I think he's coward. He's a true representative of a psychopath. And he should know he's a real murderer. So I think he's where he belongs to be.
He's still young enough to live his life again. And in my view, he's still a threat. He'll be a high-risk violent offender. He'll be monitored. But she's lost her life. And who knows what Linah could have become. And that little girl's lost her mum. It's heartbreaking.
David took Linah's life, but he wasn't the only one being investigated. Those closest to Linah wanted answers as to why, despite repeated warnings, he was allowed the opportunity to kill her.
After the trial had finished, the police issued a full apology for their failings, and they acknowledged that they had not shown the service that they should provide to the community.
If all this organization had done more to help her, the police, if they had done a lot, and actually respond to the calls, to the alarm, I think David would have been scared. They could have done better to protect her, to listen to her as well.
As they face up to life without her, Linah's family and friends wanted lessons to be learned from her death.
We were instructed or approached by Linah Keza's family shortly after her death because they had serious concerns that Linah had been let down by the police.
Lawyer Sophie Naftalin worked closely with Ivan to get to the truth of what went wrong.
Linah had been trying to get protection and help from them, and that they didn't listen. In order to find out what happened and to get to the bottom of it was to engage in the investigation that was undertaken by the IOPC, which is the Independent Office for Police Conduct. And in that process, they gave accounts of their experience. Ivan talked about what had happened and what he had known.
If only the police protocols put in place for exactly this sort of incident had been followed, the police would have been able to protect her, and she would have been taken into a place where she would have been safe. An exclusion zone would have been put around her.
It took around 3 years for that investigation to conclude, which of course was agony for the family. The IOPC found that 3 officers had a case to answer for gross misconduct in terms of the failings of how they had risk assessed the case. Those 3 officers, the punishment for having committed gross misconduct is that all 3 of them got a final written warning. Even though the family felt vindicated that these officers had been found guilty of gross misconduct, they found it just shocking that none of those officers lost their job.
This is a truly tragic case, not only because of the brutal butchering of a beautiful young girl, but the mistakes that were made, the police failures to follow their own protocol, is a terrible tragedy, because that ultimately was what led to her death at the hands of Gikawa. The police were unable to protect her.
Linah might be here today and she'd have seen her lovely little girl grow up, and that will never happen now. Linah's life has gone at the hands of a controlling, coercive, violent ex-partner.
Her family want lessons to be learned from her case and her death to be used as a tool to improve systems so that the same doesn't happen again.
What's so desperately tragic here is Linah's no longer with us. This is a relationship that was dreadful for her, but the connection that she had to him was the 2-year-old, the innocent victim in this terrible, terrible story, aside from Linah, was that child.
Without Linah, it's sad. I really missed her. Now we are trying to bring up her daughter. Now she's with us. And then the connection she was putting more on our family also, I think, the smile, the jokes, the sense of humor. Even her friend, so to a friend, she was a good friend. To a sister, a great sister. As a mother, she was one of the most proudest mother you can never see. She was so happy, so proud of her daughter.
It's easy to end up in a bad relationship, and thankfully, some people escape and are able to try and move on. Tragically, Linah never had that chance.